Hello, I'm Professor Jason Young. I'm a social psychologist at Hunter College of the City University of New York, and I am going to be giving a talk today on the nature of fear of crime and basically how people examine their concerns about when we feel safe in various environments. The formal title of my talk is The Moderating Role of Culture on the Link Between Personality and Fear of Crime. And my co-author is Professor Derek Chady at the University of the West Indies in San Agustin in Trinidad. The big focus for my talk today is going to be looking at a couple of critical factors, one more of an external sociological factor, and the other a much more internal psychological one. The external factor is the role of ethnicity. And ethnicity in this case reflects not just someone's general sociological background, but also kind of the worldview that comes along with that ethnic frame of mind. The psychological factor I'm looking at is something called intolerance of uncertainty, which reflects the degree to which people are relatively more or less comfortable with the degree of uncertainty in their lives. Some folks are very tolerant of uncertainty, and they may go into a situation and say, hey, whatever happens, happens. Let's throw caution to the wind, and we'll just see where we end up. But then there are other folks who often want to know what the end goal is and where things will stand. And they're the ones, for example, when they go into a situation, they'd like to know ahead of time exactly what to expect. Well, we look at these two factors in the context of fear of crime, precisely because fear of crime is something that is intrinsically unpredictable. And as a result of that, we're very much interested in how different frames of mind that people have, whether as a result of their ethnic background or as a result of this psychological personality factor of intolerance of uncertainty, and how that may shape the way people frame their notion of whether their environment is safe or whether they are correct in having a high degree of fear of crime. Well, beginning with the issue of ethnicity, the study that I'm going to describe reflects a survey that was conducted in the country of Trinidad in the Caribbean. The ethnic breakdown of this country is, in fact, rather neatly divided into almost thirds. 1/3 of the population is of Afro-Trinidadian background. These are people who were originally brought to Trinidad as slaves back in the 16 and 1700s. A second third of the population are Indo-Trinidadian, and these were people who were brought to, or who moved to Trinidad, were actually brought to Trinidad as indentured servants once slavery was outlawed, and they came in the 1800s. And the final rough third of the population are simply what's called mixed Trinidadian, which is in fact a variety of different backgrounds that come from both Indo background, Afro background, and then a variety of others. With respect to the internal factor of intolerance of uncertainty, we were very much interested in the degree to which those people who are relatively less comfortable with unpredictable situations would express a higher degree of fear of crime. Or to put it another way, we predicted that there would be a positive correlation between intolerance of uncertainty, that is this discomfort with unpredictability, and one's level of fear of crime. There are a number of implications looking at this particular personality factor of intolerance of uncertainty, beginning with the fact that we can break down the various effects that it may trigger among three different dimensions that social psychologists often are very interested in. The first of which are cognitive. Okay? And in this respect, we're interested in the cognitive reactions to fear of crime with the presumption that those individuals who have a greater intolerance of uncertainty will be more inclined to rationalize when concrete evidence is not available. And so when it comes to thinking about crime levels and personal safety, those individuals with a higher level of intolerance of uncertainty be more likely to try to come up with their own narrative on the spot, even if the information that's available is incomplete or is based on rather spotty media accounts of what is going on. The second type of reaction that individuals could have is an emotional or affective one. In this case, intolerance of uncertainty, higher levels of intolerance of uncertainty, are predicted to result in greater levels of fear and greater likelihood of perceiving threats in the environment around them. And then finally, the third domain in which we look at reactions are the behavioral ones. Here again, we're predicting that those individuals with a higher intolerance of uncertainty may be more likely to engage in more vigilant protective behavior. Things like avoiding dark alleys, dark streets in the evening, and things of that nature that would reflect kind of behaviorally their fear of crime. Now, because once again, the nature of crime is inherently unpredictable, we are looking at this positive correlation between intolerance of uncertainty and fear of crime. And the cornerstone of this particular project and of what I'm going to talk about today is a rather simplified examination of this straightforward prediction. Okay, greater tolerance of uncertainty produces greater fear of crime, which shows itself in these three different dimensions: the cognitive, the affective, and the behavioral. The study that we conducted was a survey. It was conducted using 3,003 participants nationwide in Trinidad and Tobago, using a multi-stage cluster sample survey method of private households. We actually had research associates going door to door, contacting people at random, using a randomized strategy to provide data for our survey. The survey itself took roughly 45 minutes to complete. And our final sample in the study consisted of 53% females, 47% males. The ethnicity of our survey somewhat roughly mirrored the actual underlying population demographics. 40% of our sample were Indo-Trinidadian, 36% were Afro-Trinidadian, and roughly 23% were of mixed background. Again, the critical measures that we focused on most straightforwardly was a cultural measure of ethnicity, as well as a personality measure of intolerance of uncertainty. Because we broke down the different types of reactions that people might show in these different areas, when it comes to the emotional measures of fear of crime, we actually had a general measure of fear of crime, which was kind of like a broad-based measure that asked general questions like, to what extent do you fear that crime is something that you're vulnerable to? We also had a secondary measure which looked at more specific reactions people might show in terms of fear of crime. This one is adapted by Chady and Ying, and it includes what are called abstract versus pragmatic fearful reactions. An example of an abstract fearful reaction is things like fear of the unknown. We would simply ask people, to what extent do each of the following things reflect a major concern of yours? And so an abstract fear would be fear of the unknown, fear of being exposed to danger in general. But there was a separate scale here of pragmatic fear. And this involved just sort of a generalized concern that people might have towards specific types of risks. And one of these, in fact, quite presciently was fear of getting ill, fear of being exposed to germs. Okay? Now, this survey was actually conducted a few years ago, well before the worldwide pandemic. But nevertheless, these questions that we asked were designed to sort of tease out the extent to which people had sort of floating in their day-to-day thoughts, different range of types of fears. And then a final measure of fear was the perceived risk of victimization scale. And here we were really concerned about the degree to which people thought about how likely they were to, for lack of a better term, say, become a statistic, okay? That they might become a victim of crime, or one of those things that you read about or hear about in the media. What do they feel is their own risk that could happen to them? That perceived risk of victimization scale, while it reflected some affective aspects, it also constituted part of our cognitive measure of reactions to crime, because to the extent that it involved people doing sort of mental calculations, not just the perceived degree that they're going to be a victim and what their feelings are about that, but also just the way they simply, and the degree to which they actually calculate the risk of their becoming a victim. We also had a second cognitive measure, which involved the degree to which people typically think about concerns affecting their community. And there are three general directions that this concern about the community, one's community, might have. One is the degree of incivilities, concerns about sort of people misbehaving in the street, people behaving in a rude way, people loitering around empty buildings. There was also a community concern related to infrastructure, the degree to which there are broken down buildings, broken streetlights, broken street furniture, things that made the neighborhood look like it was in disarray. And then the final community concern was sort of a general concern about crime in one's own community, not just crime in general. And so there we were very much interested in the degree to which people might be thinking about how their neighborhood maybe is going downhill as a result of crime. Finally, with respect to behavioral measures of people's reactions to crime, we had a number of specific behaviors that we asked people about and the degree to which they had undertaken those behaviors within the previous few months. This included measures of behavior to protect one's own property. An example of this is simply installing new door locks or putting security lights around one's home. But separate from that, we also had a separate measure of the behaviors taken to try to protect one's personal safety. And here we ask questions like the degree to which one may avoid walking alone at night. Well, let me turn quickly to the results of our study, beginning with the issue of fear of crime in general. And what we found, quite interestingly, was that the one group that overwhelmingly had the highest level of fear of crime among the three ethnicities that we looked at were the Indo-Trinidadians. The range of scores on the fear of crime scale could go from 40 to 100. And so essentially towards the midpoint of this scale, we found Indo-Trinidadians had the greatest amount of fear of crime. Mixed Trinidadians had somewhat lesser fear of crime. And finally, Afro-Trinidadians had a relatively lower fear of crime. We also looked at the mean differences in intolerance of uncertainty. And here we again found that in general, Indo-Trinidadians had a higher level of intolerance of uncertainty on average, followed by mixed Trinidadians, followed by Afro-Trinidadians, who had the relatively lowest level of intolerance of uncertainty. So we're seeing a pattern that seems to suggest that there might be a link between intolerance of uncertainty and fear of crime. But the next step was for us to correlate these scores, okay? One's individual score of intolerance of uncertainty, as well as one's expressed fear of crime. And here we found some rather surprising results, ones that we will spend some time now trying to unpack and explain. But essentially, when we correlated intolerance of uncertainty with fear of crime, the only subgroup that showed even a moderate correlation between these two factors were Afro-Trinidadians. And yes, that's correct. The same group that seemed to show relatively lower fear of crime and relatively lower intolerance of uncertainty was the only group that actually showed a correlation between those two factors, such that among Afro-Trinidadians, those who had a relatively higher intolerance of uncertainty also showed relatively higher fear of crime. By contrast, among the Indo-Trinidadians and the mixed group, no such relationship exists. In trying to better understand what might be going on, we looked at various correlations of the different factors, sort of unpacking people's reactions to fear of crime, to see what might be happening in the various reactions among the different ethnic groups. And so, for example, with respect to the cognitive factors, perceived risk of victimization showed a positive correlation with fear of crime for all three ethnic groups. And the relative strength across the three did not show a statistically significant difference, but we definitely see that among Afro-Trinidadians, the relationship is pretty strong. Among Indo-Trinidadians, it is also strong, though somewhat less. And among mixed Trinidadians, those with mixed ethnic background, they also showed very strong correlation between perceived risk of victimization and fear of crime. With respect to community concerns, here again, we did not see much difference between the three ethnic groups. All three showed positive correlations. Essentially, the greater the number of expressed community concerns that one had, the greater one's overall fear of crime. With respect to the emotional factors and reactions to crime, here we also found sort of a more general, similar pattern of strong positive correlations. This was true whether we looked at the abstract general fear subscale, okay, that showed strong correlations with underlying fear of crime, as did the pragmatic general fear subscale. So once again, abstract fear were things like fear of the unknown. Pragmatic fear was things like fear of falling, fear of getting ill, fear of being exposed to viruses, and so on. The final subfactor that we looked at was the behavioral factor. And in this case, we found that for person protective factors, there was not much of a difference between the three groups, such that Afro-Trinidadians, Indo-Trinidadians, and mixed ethnic background individuals all showed roughly a similar association between the number of protective factors that they undertook for protecting their person and their underlying fear of crime. Unusually, though, when it comes to property, here we found that there was a sort of a small to modest correlation between property protective factors and fear of crime only for the Indo-Trinidadian and the mixed ethnic background groups. But we found no such correlation, no systematic correlation between property protective behaviors and fear of crime among the Afro-Trinidadian group. So the predictors of fear of crime across ethnicities, for the most part, are very similar. The critical difference is that the Afro-Trinidadian group, and only the Afro-Trinidadian group, seem to show a slightly different pattern, particularly when it came to intolerance of uncertainty, as well as that property protective behaviors that we just saw on the previous slide. So one of the big questions that we have is, what is it about intolerance of uncertainty that may explain its exceptional pattern among Afro-Trinidadians? Well, among the things that we noticed was that when we looked at the correlation of these different components of fear of crime with intolerance of uncertainty, here again, we replicate the pattern that all of those factors show modest correlations with fear of crime. With intolerance of uncertainty, but only for Afro-Trinidadians. So when it comes to perceived risk of victimization, community concerns, and safety measures taken, all three of those, the more of those types of reactions that Afro-Trinidadians had, the greater their level of intolerance of uncertainty. But this did not appear to be the case among the Indo-Trinidadians and was at a very weak to modest level for the mixed ethnic Trinidadians. To try to better decipher what is going on here, we again examined both person-level factors and group-level factors. Try to better understand this ethnic difference in risk sensitivity. Well, one of the things that we looked at was the role of religion and spirituality and its link with intolerance of uncertainty. One of the areas of research that has received extensive attention is the fact that intolerance of uncertainty basically addresses how well people cope with the ambiguous and unpredictable. And past research has suggested that those higher in intolerance of uncertainty show stronger religious beliefs and spirituality, and religion may help explain the unknowable. So for those with a higher level of intolerance of uncertainty, possibly religion could be part of the explanation of why we found the effects that we did. So might there be religious differences across the ethnic groups to help explain where this intolerance of uncertainty effect seems to originate from? Well, we looked at some additional items from our survey, and we found that there was a relatively modest degree of religiosity and spirituality. Actually, I should say it was very much in the middle, because our scale went from 1 being very religious to 4 not at all. And everyone fell within sort of, say, the second quartile of responses of scores when it came to religiosity across all 3 ethnicities. When it came to spirituality, everyone also expressed a sort of a modest level of spirituality. However, in this case, we found that Afro-Trinidadians uniquely expressed a somewhat higher level of spirituality relative to the Indo and mixed Trinidadian groups. So spiritual belief systems might be contributing to an explanation of this difference. Moving from an individual difference, we could also look at group level explanations. And among the things that has been explored is that historians and sociologists have highlighted differences in economic vested interests among the different ethnic groups in Trinidad. And according to one critical paper by Wilson, Indo-Trinidadians tend to be more represented among the private sector, among businesses, whereas Afro-Trinidadians are relatively more represented as employees in the public sector. What this suggests then is that this may make Indo-Trinidadians generally more sensitized to overall economic threats. Remember, Indo-Trinidadians express the greatest amount of fear of crime. And this global level concern may dissociate their perception of threat from any individual level factors, such as personality traits like intolerance of uncertainty. So regardless of where Indo-Trinidadians feel personally, they nevertheless may be expressing this high degree of fear of crime because of a more global focus. One way of framing this from a social cognitive perspective involves the notion of construals. It may be that different individuals habitually construe the world using different levels of abstraction. So one possibility in explaining the greater levels of fear and lack of connection to personality factors among Indo-Trinidadians is that their focus is on the more abstract big picture rather than immediate personal concerns. By contrast, at a psychological level, Afro-Trinidadians may have construals that have less of a vested interest at the global level and they may be relatively more focused on and sensitized to more immediate inputs of information that suggest a threat to them, resulting in the more direct correspondence that we found between intolerance of uncertainty and fear of crime. Given these different types of perspectives, this dynamic is the focus of additional research that we are going to be conducting shortly. Thank you very much for your time.